If I had died that morning, it would have taken my family at least 3 days to notice. The thought came to me as I lay in a hospital bed, staring at the pale ceiling tiles, listening to the soft beeping of the monitor beside me. It was a quiet room, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath, every second passing. A nurse had asked me earlier if someone was on their way, her voice gentle but routine, like she asked that question 100 times a day. I smiled and told her yes. I lied. I had been there for 6 hours already. No calls. No texts. No footsteps rushing down the hallway calling my name. Just the steady hum of machines and the distant sound of carts rolling past my door. I folded my hands over the thin blanket, noticing how small they looked, how the veins stood out more than they used to. 72 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly invisible. It hadn't always been like this, or maybe it had, and I just hadn't wanted to see it. The doctor had said I was lucky. Another 30 minutes, he told me, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed my chart. And this could have been a very different conversation. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. I nodded politely, the way I always did, as if we were discussing something minor, like the weather or a delayed appointment. But inside, something shifted. 30 minutes. That was all that stood between me being here and not being here. And the truth settled over me slowly, like a cold draft through an open window. No one would have known. Not right away. Not even Daniel. Especially not Rachel. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that realization sink deeper than I was ready for. Daniel used to call me every Sunday. That had been our routine for years, even after he got married. He'd tell me about work, about little things, about nothing important. I used to think those calls meant something. But then they became shorter, then less frequent, then gone. At first, there were excuses. He was busy. Rachel had plans. Life gets complicated, Margaret, I told myself. Be understanding. Be patient. I had always been patient. I remembered the last Thanksgiving I hosted. I had spent 3 days preparing, standing in my kitchen measuring flour, stirring gravy, setting the table with the good china I only used for family. I even polished the silverware myself, something my late husband used to tease me about. No one notices those details but you, he'd say, smiling. But I noticed. I always noticed. That year, dinner was supposed to be at 4 p.m. By 5, the turkey had gone cold. By 6, I stopped checking my phone. Around 7, Daniel finally texted. Sorry, Mom. Something came up. Rain check. No explanation. No call. Just 2 short sentences that erased 3 days of effort like it meant nothing. I told him it was fine. I always said it was fine. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We make excuses for them. We soften the sharp edges of their neglect until it barely cuts on the surface. But it cuts deeper over time. It settles somewhere quiet, somewhere you don't look too closely. Until one day, you're lying in a hospital bed, and there's nowhere left to look but straight at it. The nurse came back in the afternoon to check my vitals. She smiled kindly, adjusting the cuff around my arm. Has your family been notified? She asked again. This time, I didn't answer right away. I thought about Daniel sitting in his office, or maybe at home, scrolling through his phone. I thought about Rachel, her perfectly organized calendar, her carefully planned days that never seemed to include me. I thought about how easy it had become for them to go on without me. No, I said finally, my voice calm, steady. Not yet. The nurse hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more, but then she nodded and moved on. The room fell silent again. I turned my head slightly, looking at the empty chair by the window. It was meant for visitors, for family, for someone who cared enough to sit beside you and hold your hand while you waited for answers. It remained untouched, and that's when the truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about a busy week or a missed call. This wasn't about life getting in the way. This was years. Years of being slowly pushed to the side, quietly replaced, gently removed from the center of a life I had helped build. I exhaled slowly, feeling a strange sense of clarity settle over me. If I had died that morning, nothing in their world would have stopped. Not immediately, not urgently. And that realization didn't break me. It didn't make me cry. It did something else. Something quieter. Something colder. It made me understand that whatever place I thought I still had in their lives didn't exist anymore. The decision did not come all at once. It arrived quietly, like everything else had, settling into my thoughts over the course of that long afternoon. I remained in my chair by the window, watching the light shift across the floor, noticing how the room changed as the hours passed without anyone marking the time but me. At some point, I realized I had not turned on the television, had not reached for the radio, had not filled the silence with anything at all. For years, I had done that without thinking. Background noise to soften the emptiness. Now, I let the quiet stay. It felt more honest that way. I stood up slowly and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I rarely used anymore. A thin layer of dust covered its surface, and I brushed it away with the side of my hand before sitting down. Inside the drawer were old documents, neatly organized in folders I had labeled years ago. Insurance papers, bank statements, a copy of my will. I paused for a moment before opening that folder, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. I knew exactly what it contained. I had written it during a time when everything still felt certain, when I believed the future would follow the same patterns as the past. Daniel had been listed as the primary beneficiary, of course. Everything I had built, everything I had saved, everything I had preserved through careful decisions and quiet sacrifices was meant to pass on to him. That had never felt like a question. It was simply what mothers did. I opened the folder and read through the pages slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it with clear eyes. The language was formal, precise, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. It spoke of assets and distribution, of intentions and final wishes. It did not speak of absence. It did not account for what happens when the people you write those words for are no longer present in the ways that matter. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it, feeling its weight in a way I had not before. This was not just paper. It was a reflection of a life I had assumed would remain connected, even as it quietly unraveled. I stood up again and walked into the hallway, stopping in front of the mirror that hung beside the closet. I looked at my reflection for a long moment, noticing the lines that had deepened over the years, the silver in my hair, the calm in my expression that had replaced something softer I used to recognize. I did not look fragile. I did not look uncertain. I looked aware. That was the difference. I returned to the desk and picked up the folder once more, this time carrying it with me into the kitchen. I set it down on the table and pulled out a chair, sitting in the same place I had sat so many mornings before. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because I had. I reached for a pen and placed it beside the folder, not opening it yet, just letting it sit there between my hands. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had never entertained before. What if everything I had planned no longer made sense? The thought did not frighten me. It did not feel reckless or impulsive. It felt logical, measured, long overdue. I thought about the hospital room, the empty chair by the window, the question the nurse had asked me more than once. I thought about the phone that had not rung, the messages that had not come. I thought about the years that had led to that moment, each one adding another layer to a truth I had only just begun to accept. And then I thought about the future, not in terms of time, but in terms of choice. For so long, I had believed that my role was fixed, that my purpose was tied to maintaining connections, even when those connections had become one-sided. I had believed that giving more would somehow restore what was fading. But, sitting there now, with the folder in front of me and the quiet surrounding me, I understood something I had missed before. Giving without being seen does not strengthen a bond. It erases you from it. I picked up the pen and turned it slowly between my fingers, not rushing, not forcing anything. This was not about anger. It was not about punishment. It was about alignment. About making my choices reflect the reality I was now willing to see. I opened the folder again, flipping past the first page, scanning the familiar lines with a different perspective. Daniel's name stood there, unchanged, certain. For years, that certainty had comforted me. Now, it felt like a question waiting to be answered. I set the pen down again and leaned back in my chair, letting the moment stretch just a little longer. There was no urgency, no pressure, just clarity, steady and undeniable. Outside, a car passed by, the sound fading quickly into the distance. I listened to it until it was gone, then looked back at the papers in front of me. This was where things would begin to change. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but deliberately, quietly, the same way everything else had happened. The difference was that this time, I was the one deciding. I did not make the call that day, or the day after, and by the third day, The silence between us had stretched so naturally that it no longer felt like something that needed to be explained. I moved through my routines with a quiet precision, making my meals, watering the small plant by the window, folding laundry that no one else would ever wear or notice. There was a steadiness to it, a calm that I had not felt in years, as if something inside me had finally stopped waiting. On the fourth day, the phone rang. The sound was sudden, almost unfamiliar, cutting through the quiet in a way that made me pause before reaching for it. I glanced at the screen. Daniel. I let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Hello, I said, my voice even composed. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that suggested he had not expected me to answer so calmly. Mom, he said, his tone uncertain as if testing the word. I have been meaning to call. I have just been busy. I nodded slightly, though he could not see me. I understand, I replied. And I did. I understood more than he realized. He exhaled softly, perhaps relieved that I had not asked questions, had not made it difficult. Rachel mentioned we have not seen you in a while. We were thinking maybe we could stop by this weekend, just for a quick visit. The words were carefully chosen. Casual. Controlled. As if this were a simple scheduling matter, something that could be adjusted with a few polite sentences. I looked around the room as he spoke, taking in the same details I had seen every day, the same quiet space that had held me without interruption. That would be fine, I said. No warmth. No resistance. Just a statement. We exchanged a few more words. Nothing meaningful, nothing that reached beyond the surface. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a moment, letting the silence return. It felt different now. Not empty. Not heavy. Just present. Saturday arrived without announcement, marked only by the steady movement of time and the soft light that filled the house. I prepared nothing special. No elaborate meals. No careful arrangements. I made a pot of coffee, set out 3 cups instead of 1, and waited. When the doorbell rang, I stood and walked to the door at an unhurried pace, opening it to find Daniel and Rachel standing side by side. They looked exactly as I remembered. Well-dressed, composed, slightly distant. Daniel leaned in to hug me, a brief gesture that felt more like habit than intention. It is good to see you, Mom, he said. Rachel smiled politely, her expression warm but measured. We have been meaning to visit, she added. I stepped aside and let them in without comment. They moved through the house as guests might, glancing around as if noticing things for the first time, though nothing had changed. We sat in the living room, the 3 of us arranged in a space that once felt full and now felt carefully balanced. Daniel asked about my health, his tone attentive but slightly detached. I answered simply. I had a small issue. It has been handled. He nodded, accepting the explanation without pressing further. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. You really should have told us, she said. We would have come. I met her gaze, holding it for just a moment longer than necessary. I know, I replied. And that was all. The conversation moved on, shifting to safer topics. Work, plans, small details that filled the space without adding anything to it. I listened, responding when needed, observing more than engaging. There was something different now, something they seemed to sense but could not quite name. The ease they once had in my presence was gone, replaced by a subtle awareness, a recognition that something had shifted. At one point, Daniel glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. You did not have to make anything, he said, noticing the simplicity of the table. We just wanted to stop by. I nodded. I know, I said again. The visit did not last long. An hour, perhaps a little more. When they stood to leave, Daniel hesitated for a moment, as if searching for something to say. We should do this more often, he offered. I looked at him, really looked this time, seeing not just the son I had raised, but the man he had become. Perhaps, I replied. Rachel gave me another polite smile, her eyes briefly scanning the room before turning toward the door. They stepped outside together, their movements synchronized, practiced. I watched them from the doorway as they walked to their car, speaking quietly to each other in a way that did not include me. When they drove away, I closed the door gently and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the handle. The house settled back into its familiar stillness, but something about it felt different now. Not because they had come, but because I had not needed them to. I turned and walked back into the living room, sitting down in my chair by the window. The sunlight had shifted again, casting new patterns across the floor. I followed them with my eyes, noticing how they moved without asking anything from me. For the first time in a long time, I felt no urge to reach for the phone, no instinct to fill the silence, no need to hold on to something that had already let go. And in that quiet, steady moment, I understood that the distance between us was no longer something I was trying to close. It was something I was finally willing to accept. The morning after their visit, I woke up with a sense of quiet clarity that felt different from anything I had experienced before. It was not relief, and it was not sadness. It was something steadier, something that did not depend on anyone else's actions or words. I moved through the house the same way I always did, but this time, each step felt deliberate, as if I were finally walking through a space that belonged entirely to me. The coffee tasted the same, the light fell through the window the same way, but I noticed everything more clearly, as if the world had sharpened overnight. I did not check my phone. I did not wait for it to ring. That small change alone felt significant, like setting down a weight I had been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. Later that morning, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple outfit I had not worn in a while, something neat and composed but not meant to impress anyone. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment, adjusting the collar, smoothing the fabric, observing myself with a level of attention I had not given in years. There was no need to rush. No one was expecting me. And yet, I felt a quiet sense of purpose. I picked up my purse, checked that I had everything I needed, and stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a soft, final sound that lingered just a second longer than usual. The drive to the office was familiar, a route I had taken before, though not often in recent years. The building stood in the same place, its glass doors reflecting the morning sky, unchanged and indifferent. I parked the car and sat for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, allowing the stillness to settle before I stepped out. Inside, the air was cool, the reception area quiet except for the faint tapping of keys from somewhere behind the desk. The receptionist looked up as I approached, her expression polite, professional. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" I returned her smile. "I have an appointment," I replied, giving my name clearly. She nodded and asked me to take a seat, her voice calm, efficient. I sat down in the waiting area, folding my hands in my lap, observing the room around me. There were a few chairs, a table with neatly arranged magazines, a clock on the wall that ticked softly, marking time in a way that felt steady and predictable. I did not feel nervous. I did not feel uncertain. I felt ready. When my name was called, I stood and followed the assistant down a short hallway into a quiet office. The man waiting inside stood as I entered, offering a firm handshake and a polite introduction. His manner was respectful, attentive, the kind that suggested he understood the weight of the decisions discussed in rooms like this. I took a seat across from him, placing my purse neatly beside the chair. "How can I assist you today?" he asked, his tone open, neutral. I paused for a moment, not because I needed to find the words, but because I wanted to choose them carefully. "I would like to review and update my will," I said. The sentence was simple, but it carried more meaning than it would have a week ago. He nodded, reaching for a folder and opening it with practiced ease. "Of course," he replied. "We can go through everything together." As he began asking questions, I answered each one clearly, without hesitation. Names, assets, intentions, each detail laid out with a level of precision that surprised even me. At one point, he glanced up, his pen pausing briefly above the page. "And your primary beneficiary?" he asked. The room seemed to grow quieter for a moment, the ticking of the clock more noticeable now. I held his gaze steadily, aware of the significance of what I was about to say. "That is what I am here to change," I replied. There was no tremor in my voice, no uncertainty in my tone, just a statement of fact. He nodded again, this time with a slight shift in his expression, as if recognizing that this was not a routine update, but something more deliberate. We continued through the process, each step bringing a sense of alignment that I had not realized I was missing. This was not about taking something away. It was about placing things where they belonged, based on the reality I had finally accepted. When the meeting ended, I signed the necessary documents with a steady hand, the pen moving across the paper without hesitation. The finality of it did not feel heavy. It felt clear. Outside, the sun was higher in the sky now, the light brighter, the air warmer. I walked to my car at an unhurried pace, aware of each step, each breath, each moment as it passed. When I sat behind the wheel, I did not start the engine right away. I simply sat there, allowing the quiet satisfaction of what I had done to settle into place. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into a life that no longer made space for me. Today, for the first time, I had adjusted the life instead. And the difference was something I could feel in every part of me. The days after that appointment passed with a quiet rhythm that no longer felt empty, but intentional. I found myself moving through each moment with a kind of steady awareness, noticing things I had overlooked for years. The way the sunlight lingered longer in the late afternoon, the sound of my own footsteps across the floor, the simple comfort of preparing a meal just for myself, without expectation, without waiting for anyone to arrive. There was no urgency to fill the silence anymore. It was no longer something to escape. It was something I had chosen. A week later, the phone rang again. This time, I knew who it was before I even looked. Daniel had developed a pattern, even if he did not realize it. He reached out when it was convenient, when something prompted the thought, when enough time had passed that silence began to feel noticeable. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello," I said calmly. "Mom," he began, his tone slightly more direct than before. "We were thinking about coming by again this weekend. Maybe stay a little longer this time." I could hear something different in his voice. Not concern. Not quite. Something closer to curiosity, as if he had sensed a shift but could not yet understand it. "That will not be necessary," I replied. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time. "Not necessary?" he repeated. I kept my tone even. "I have been making some changes. I have other plans." It was not a lie. It was simply a truth he was not used to hearing from me. He hesitated, and for the first time in a long time, I heard uncertainty in his voice. "Oh, well, we just thought it would be good to spend some time together." I considered his words carefully before responding. "Time is important," I said. "It should be spent with intention." There was another pause, this one heavier, as if he was trying to find the right response but could not quite reach it. "Is everything okay?" he asked finally. I allowed a small breath to pass before answering. "Everything is clear," I said. "That is what matters." We exchanged a few more words, but the conversation never quite found its footing. When it ended, I placed the phone back on the table without any lingering thoughts. There was no need to replay the conversation, no need to analyze what had been said or left unsaid. The meaning had been simple. The following Saturday, I did not stay home. I dressed early, choosing the same quiet care I had taken before, and left the house before noon. The air was mild, the sky clear, the kind of day that would have once felt like an opportunity to invite someone over, to share a meal, to create a moment. Instead, I drove to a small community center I had passed many times but never entered. The building was modest, its signs slightly worn, but there was a sense of life inside that I could feel even before I stepped through the door. Voices, movement, a rhythm that existed independently of me, yet welcomed my presence without question. Inside, I was greeted by a woman about my age, her smile genuine, her eyes kind in a way that did not feel practiced. "First time here?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. "I thought I would see what this place is about." She gestured toward a group gathered around a table, engaged in conversation, their laughter soft but real. "You are welcome to join us," she said. There was no pressure in her voice, no expectation, just an open invitation. I stepped forward slowly, taking in the scene, noticing how natural it all felt. No one was checking their phone. No one was distracted. The conversations were simple, but present. I took a seat at the edge of the table, listening at first, then gradually adding a word here and there. It was not about filling space. It was about being part of something that existed in the moment, without obligation or history. Hours passed without me noticing. When I finally stood to leave, the woman who had greeted me earlier touched my arm lightly. "We hope you come back," she said. I met her gaze and smiled, a real smile this time, one I had not felt in a long while. "I think I will," I replied. Driving home, I realized something that settled quietly but firmly into place. For years, I had waited for my life to return to what it once was. I had believed that if I held on long enough, things would shift back, that the distance would close, that the connections would rebuild themselves. But now, I understood that waiting had only kept me standing still. Life had not stopped. It had simply moved in a direction that no longer included me in the way I expected. And instead of continuing to wait for something that was not coming back, I had finally taken a step forward. Not away from them, not in anger or resentment, but towards something else. Something that did not require me to be remembered in order to exist. Something that allowed me to be present without needing permission. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as always. Quiet. Still. Familiar. But as I stepped inside, I no longer saw it as a place that held what I had lost. I saw it as a place that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. 3 weeks passed before Daniel called again, and this time, I could hear it in his voice before he even spoke. Not urgency, not exactly, but something unsettled, something that did not quite fit into the calm distance we had fallen into. "Mom," he said, after I answered, his tone more direct than usual, "we need to talk." I did not respond immediately. I simply listened, allowing the silence to stretch just enough for him to continue. "I spoke with Mr. Henderson," he added, naming the attorney I had visited. "He mentioned you. Made some changes." There it was. Not concern for my health. Not curiosity about how I had been spending my days. But this. I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking out the window as the afternoon light settled across the yard. "Yes," I said calmly. "I did." There was a pause, heavier this time, as if he had expected a different response. "Why would you do that?" he asked, the question carrying a note of disbelief, almost confusion. I considered his words carefully, not searching for an answer, but deciding how much of the truth he was ready to hear. "Because things have changed," I replied. Simple, direct, honest. "Nothing has changed," he said quickly, almost too quickly. "We have just been busy. That is all." I allowed a small breath to pass before speaking again. "That is not all," I said. "But it is what you chose to see." The silence that followed was longer, filled with something neither of us named. I could almost picture him, standing somewhere familiar, his hand running through his hair the way he used to when he was trying to solve something that did not make sense to him. "Rachel thinks you might be overreacting," he said finally, his voice quieter now. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of frustration, but out of recognition. Of course she did. Rachel has always been very certain about things that do not belong to her. I replied, my tone steady, not sharp, just clear. "This belongs to me." Another pause. This one different. Not defensive, not dismissive, just uncertain. "We can fix this," he said, the words sounding less confident than he intended. "We can spend more time together. Visit more. Call more. You do not have to do something like this." I turned my head slightly, looking at the empty chair across the room, the same one that had remained untouched for so long. "You are not fixing anything," I said quietly. "You are reacting." The distinction seemed to settle between us, heavier than anything else I had said. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He simply listened. "For years," I continued, "I waited. I adjusted. I made room. I told myself it was temporary, that things would return to what they were. But they did not. And at some point, I stopped being part of your life in any meaningful way." My voice did not rise. It did not break. It remained calm, measured, each word placed carefully where it belonged. "That is not true," he said, but there was no force behind it now. Just habit. "It is," I replied. And the moment I understood that, everything became very simple. The room felt still around me, the quiet no longer something to fill, but something to stand within. "You changed things without even talking to me," he said, a trace of something softer entering his voice now. Not anger. Something closer to regret, though he had not named it yet. "I have been talking," I said. "You just were not listening." The line went silent again, but this time, it did not feel empty. It felt full. Full of everything that had gone unsaid for years, now resting between us without needing to be repeated. "So that is it?" he asked after a moment. "You are just done?" I considered the question, turning it over quietly in my mind. Done. It sounded final. Abrupt. But that was not what this was. "No," I said gently. "I am not done. I am just no longer waiting." There was nothing left to add after that. The conversation ended not with an argument, not with a resolution, but with a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and it would not shift back. When I set the phone down, I did not feel relief. I did not feel sadness. I felt steady, grounded in a way I had not been before. Outside, the light had softened, the sky moving slowly toward evening. I stood and walked to the window, watching as the day came to a close, not rushing, not holding on to anything that was passing. Life continued, just as it always had. The difference was that now, I was no longer standing still within it. And somewhere in the quiet space that followed, I realized something simple, something I had spent years overlooking. They had not suddenly remembered me. They had simply noticed that I was no longer there for them to forget. This deeply emotional entry in family stories follows the journey of an elderly mother who slowly realizes she has been quietly erased from her own family's life. After a sudden health scare leaves her alone in a hospital with no calls and no visitors. She begins to confront years of neglect, subtle distancing, and emotional absence from her son and daughter-in-law. What begins as confusion turns into clarity as the mother reflects on decades of sacrifice, love, and unwavering support that were never truly returned. Through quiet observation and restrained emotion, this powerful narrative reveals how distance in family stories is not created overnight, but through small moments of disregard that accumulate over time. As the mother returns home, she no longer waits for connection, but instead begins to reclaim her independence, making deliberate decisions about her future, including a life-changing revision of her will that reflects the reality she has finally accepted. When the son eventually reaches out, it is no longer out of care but triggered by the consequences of her choices, exposing the fragile foundation of their relationship. This story stands out among family stories for its calm, yet piercing portrayal of emotional neglect, where the absence of confrontation becomes more powerful than conflict itself. The mother's quiet strength and measured responses redefine what it means to take control, not through anger, but through clarity and self-respect. As the narrative unfolds, the presence of the son and daughter-in-law highlights the modern dynamic of disconnection within families, making this one of the most relatable family stories for audiences who understand the pain of being overlooked by those they once gave everything to. Ultimately, this is a story about awakening, about recognizing when love is no longer reciprocated, and about choosing to step forward into a life that no longer depends on being remembered. Among family stories, this narrative delivers a powerful emotional resolution that resonates long after it ends, reminding viewers that sometimes the most profound change begins the moment we stop waiting to be seen.